I'm never calling it a playground. I'm always calling it a parkour park. If you design a parkour park too much, it can leave you liable. There's almost nothing more motivating to a city than hearing voices from parents. 200,000 to $500,000 is probably the cost for that parkour park.
Welcome to, I think this is our officially 5th General Managers National call, everyone. And on the call, we have general managers and business owners from all over the country, which is super cool. I think we have 6 general managers on the call, as well as business owners and some program managers as well. Today, we have a super exciting conversation with Corey Hollingsworth, my partner, and he's going to be sharing about just developing relationships with cities and answering any questions about that process, as well as talking about what it looks like to begin creating a parkour park in your area. You know, kind of the benefits of that, how to get that started, and also answering any questions. So with that said, Corey, take it away.
Sure, yeah. Well, yeah, I think you all know me. I am Corey. I am currently the vice president for the USPK, the sports governing body for parkour in the US. My day job is I work full-time for UC Riverside for the College of Engineering. I am a fundraiser professionally. And before doing that, I was also the executive director, and prior to that, the program director for Parkour Visions up in Seattle and Portland, where we did outdoor programming, working with parks and rec, schools, community centers. And the Parkour Visions also has a long history of designing and advocating for parkour parks in North America as well. Parkour Visions has designed over a dozen parkour parks, I want to say, in North America. And then right before I left Seattle, we also started advocating for getting a parkour park set up in Seattle itself, which was historically a city that was very not interested in that. It was a very litigious city that was worried about anything that could be vaguely, quote unquote, dangerous. And we made a lot of progress with that and should be breaking ground next year. The funding is actually finally wrapping up after multiple years of pursuing funding. So that's a big win, is that Seattle should be getting a parkour park constructed in 2025. And let's see, what else? I've also worked with Seattle's Parks and Rec to try to encourage more parkour friendly policies, as well as that city in particular. If you were to get a permit for a park, you were only allowed to permit a grass field, which you can imagine is problematic for our industry. So I've gotten a wide variety of experience, I suppose, possible blocks you can run into when trying to create those sort of partnerships. That's a bit about me. I guess I'll just pause and say I'd love to hear from folks, maybe a couple people. What are things that you are looking towards? Is it more like I want to build a relationship with the city? I want to get a parkour park? Yeah, let me know. What do you want me to prioritize talking about? And you can just come off mute and shout it out or type it in the chat, whatever you'd like. Yeah, go for it, Quinn.
I'm very interested in both, but I think a good place to start would definitely be relationships with the city, because that kind of then bleeds into the next one.
Absolutely. Cool. All right, how about you, Sam?
Quite frankly, I haven't thought about this very much, but yeah, I mean, definitely I'm curious in what having that looks like. Definitely FIM has done a lot of, has traditionally tried to get some parkour parks built, and it has never really worked out particularly well. So I was never really very involved with that process though. So definitely I'm curious about what that looks like. And furthermore, if I were going to pursue something like that, what that would look like.
Sounds good. Yeah, I guess we'll start talking about general relationships with cities, because that is, like Quinn said, that is sort of the starting point in order to get a parkour park. If that is your goal, I mean, that's still going to be a process of developing a relationship with the city. So there's a couple different ways to go about it. It's sort of a question of what kind of resources you have as a gym manager or someone who owns a gym or is the head coach for a gym. I mean, you have a good foundation in that you have an existing community that probably would like to have a parkour park or probably would like to have more formal trainings. So, like the ability to train outside in a location without getting kicked out, right? So it's sort of a question of like, are you trying to, you may even want to, as a gym manager, just want to expand your income by, you've already filled up all your classes in your gym. Maybe we can run some classes at a local community center, or maybe we can run some classes at a school. So I'll talk about kind of the differences of those things and some of the things that you can run into. A school is probably your best bet, I would say, for a lot of people. The difference that we found between schools and community centers was schools basically did your marketing for you versus a community center. Oftentimes, at least in the Seattle area and the Portland area, you had to do your own marketing to run a class in the community center, once you got like signed up for that class. So that's right off the bat, like a question of, do you have the space to advertise for essentially like a whole nother location? Just like opening a gym location, it's going to be cheaper obviously than opening up a gym location to go to a community center. But, you're basically having to do double the work for marketing that is location specific. I will say I have seen people run classes in community centers before they opened a gym. So that could be an opportunity to, if you ever wanted to open like a second location, branching out to a community center and building that community first with just a couple of vault boxes and some like basic indoor equipment makes a big difference. A big reason why community centers are great, though, is most of the time they are run by Parks and Rec. You want to be looking for the ones that are literally called like the Parks and Rec community centers or whatnot, because the YMCA, Boys and Girls Club, while they're great partners to work with, they are not run by the city. They're run by their own nonprofits. The other one was schools. I mean, you can go the public school route, you can go the private school route, you can work with Title I schools, which is essentially like low income communities. So it again depends on what your goal is there. But I mention all those to be said, if you are trying to build a relationship with your city, having a community and saying, I run classes in 5 different community centers, or I work with these 5 different public schools, really does boost, your reputation as an organization for the city. So that's one possible way, is just running classes. I will say that teaching classes either indoors or outdoors in a satellite location is very different than running classes in a gym. Just in the fact that like you may have how many coaches are going to be there? Is it going to be one coach for a small group of students? Does that coach feel supported? Do they have a second coach with them so that they have a little bit of like back and forth? Coaches oftentimes can feel more isolated, to be honest, when running classes alone, as opposed to in like a community hub setting, like a gym. So that's something to think of, is how do you have oversight? How do you make sure that the check-in system works? Do you have like a coach who feels pretty confident in being independent? Well, let me think of what else. I guess this is a question for y'all. Like, does anyone see themselves wanting to explore classes in community centers or schools or any of that sort? YMCAs, Boys and Girls Clubs?
Potentially as an option to grow, or if in a transitionary period to explore our options and continue making revenue while we might be moving gyms or trying to develop that relationship. Being able to have that as a route would be very, very beneficial.
Yeah. I think it's a great backup as well, that if you ever do have to, I mean, we all know about like issues with landlords with parkour gyms in our industry, and having that as a backup of saying we teach like maybe 2 classes a week, or, 1 evening a week at another satellite location does help you if you ever have to have those issues. Because it does, to get the startup going with those partners, it can take a couple quarters to do it. Most of those organizations, sometimes you'll find a school that's like very ad hoc and is like, yeah, we'll just throw you in a week before our quarter starts and we'll just add you to the calendar. But for the most part, I've seen with YMCAs especially, that if you want to start summer programs, you got to be talking to them like, before spring, probably in winter, to get that set up. Or, it doesn't have to be summer specific. That could be during school year as well. If you're talking to them in fall, you might be starting up programs in spring. So that's just something to be aware of. And the other thing to be aware of as well is, so at one point with Parkour Visions, we had, I want to say like almost 24 locations during COVID, during the 2020 pandemic, shutdown. We basically were just like, hey, you got a group of kids, we'll make a little COVID pod and we'll assign a coach. And that was pretty much how we survived that year. When we then tried, as things were opening up, we tried to consolidate our locations because that was a lot of travel for our coaches. We found that parents really, really rely on that one common location. So even if it was a park that was like a 10 or 15-minute drive away, for some parents, that was a big ask. So it's something to be aware of, is when you are building communities or when you're building classes, you are building a community and people rely on that specific location. It's more like the really, really focused people who love parkour and want to travel and almost do like parkour tourism to see all the spots. They have to be really invested in parkour, versus most people are looking for somewhere that they feel safe and that they know how to get to reliably week after week, especially if they're taking their kid after school or something. So treating it like I'm trying to create a community hub in this park, and this park has a community center attached to it, or at this YMCA or whatnot, it's pretty important to look for that location. And then if you are trying to create a satellite location for your existing gym, you do want to have some awareness of, is this the same community or is this a different community of who shows up to my gym? Because it's probably, if you want it to be a backup for if you have trust issues with your landlord, you don't want it to be so far away that all your members don't want to travel to it, which is probably like 15 minutes away. But then is that location competing with your gym, right? So those are things to think about. Yeah, that's a great point, Brennan. Anyone else have questions around like satellite locations? Right, I will take the resounding silence as a no. So the other avenues, if you're like, I have no interest in satellite locations, but I know I want to build a positive relationship with the city. Another big way of doing it, if you don't want to be like, I have 5 different classes at a community center, which again is great because we've had instances where when we finally went to meet with Parks and Rec officials that were higher up, they were like, oh yeah, we know you. You're in X, Y, and Z of our community centers. We're aware of you. You have good standing with our community. The community center managers like you, essentially. That can go a really, really long way. Another way to build positive relationships that I think we don't do enough as a community anymore, especially over the past multiple decades of parkour in America, as gyms have come up, is leave no trace jams. If you remember ever doing like a park cleanup jam, that is such a huge thing to show the city that you really care about their city. Oftentimes, parks and rec are underfunded. And if you can go to a place that is just full of trash, maybe even needles, bring a sharps bin or something and demonstrate that you are here to benefit the city, that goes a long, long way. And you can expand upon that too. You can run a jam that has a leave no trace thing, make sure to take photos, if you can, and you can even invite a reporter to come along and, from like the Seattle Times, or whatever your local newspaper is, and say, hey, we're parkour, we're part of this community, and we really care about the parks, we're cleaning it up, right? Having that blueprint or footprint, of being there month over month, saying we've been cleaning up this park for X, Y, and Z, however long, makes a huge impact again in building that sustained relationship. What cities are used to is people going to their public hearings and making demands. And if you can already have a good standing with them by saying, we've given something to the community, we offer these classes through your system that are helpful, we offer these park cleanups, like those go a long, 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 long way. Beyond that, the other way to develop a relationship is through your city council. So that usually has some sort of, ulterior motive, such as I want to get a parkour park, but getting in front of the city council and saying, here's us, and this is what we care about, this is what we want to see. That's where the decision making happens, that's where the votes happen, that's where allocation of funding happens. So those are sort of like your main avenues for building those connections. I'll also mention too, if you are not quite sure that you want to run classes like a weekly basis, or which I think I neglected to mention that, usually schools and community centers, they work usually on a quarterly basis. So you're probably going to get like a series of classes, which is very different than the way a gym membership works. So that's also something just to kind of think of, financially. I think I'll also mention too that if you're not sure if you want to go the class route, you can still go the events route. Maybe if it's not a Leave No Trace jam, maybe it's like a pop-up, like a spot mod, we've heard it before, a pop-up play park or something to that effect, bringing some vault boxes out. Does your city have any existing festivals? I think Seattle had, what were they called? They were basically like this twice a year festival where a bunch of different like sports and kids activities would go to, and it was at a park. It had some like catchy name like let's spring take off or something like that. I'm probably butchering the name. I don't remember what it was called. But those kind of events where it's basically a festival and you can get a booth and bring out a little like mini parkour play area, using your own equipment. That's another way of showing people what parkour looks like. I think we're all familiar with the common like concerns about parkour, the concern of like, oh no, this is dangerous and it's going to be a bunch of hooligans and whatnot. The more you can physically just demonstrate that like the majority of people who are going to be using the park's equipment to do parkour are kids. We're teaching them safely. Look, it's not that much different than play. You could even use the route of intergenerational play as well. If you get like parents playing with their kids, I mean, those are the kinds of marketing things that work really well in building that relationship, is they want to see that everyday people in the city are going to utilize parkour. So I think from there, any other questions before I transition into just talking about like parkour parks? Okay, all right. Yeah, go for it, Mitchell.
Another example that's not as effective as schools and community centers that we've used, but is like a lot less of a lift, is we help out with our church, with my church's like springtime wall block party for the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Super easy. We've also worked with another church who's reached out to us via one of our customers for like a VBS. So like those are, if you're not looking at doing a big commitment for weekly classes outside while managing a gym, those are just one-offs that you can do to also possibly take to the city.
Absolutely. And those could be marketing events, right, for your gym as well. They don't have to be a separate activity. It can be a 2-for-1, kill two birds with one stone. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I think that ties us in well to parkour parks. So with parkour parks, there's about 4 stages. The first stage is outreach and advocacy, which is basically what we just talked about. So outreach and advocacy, that can take anywhere from 1 to 5 years, if not more. We'll talk about why. The second one is acquiring funding. That can also take up to half a decade. I can talk more about that as why as well. The design process can actually be relatively quick. I mean, it can be as informal as, whipping something up in Vector, or even sketching something up that an architect firm can translate. Or it could be something more formal, working with someone like Colin McDonald, who's an experienced designer who knows how to essentially talk to the architect firm and talk about all the materials and whatnot. But still, the design process is relatively quick. Then from there is the actual construction, which could take like, say, a year, which oftentimes is rolled into other park projects as well that are being constructed at that time. So just as I think while parkour parks are very, very cool, they do take years, decades. And I think it's something that if it's something you care about, it's one of those things that just like once a quarter do one action towards it. Like it can take, like I said, it can take many, many years for that outreach and advocacy side. So basically with the city, as a default, most cities are not going to know that they want a parkour park, and they're not even going to know what parkour is. So you're going to deal with the common objections that you get for parkour. We've gotten lucky in the past, sometimes like some of the early Park Revisions parks designs where cities reaching out to Park Revisions and saying, hey, we want a parkour park. But that is usually a situation where they have already acquired funding for a park that is getting renovated, and usually it's something like they've learned about parkour because of, like, maybe they want to do something called like an action park, which is where you have like a BMX track, you maybe have a skate park, and then we're going to try this new fancy thing, which is a parkour park. Like, that's how the park in Idaho was built, the park that's up in Bellingham, Washington, which is 2 hours north of Seattle, up near the border, how that one was built as well. So most commonly, parkour parks are going to get placed in a park that is actively being renovated. I haven't seen a lot of instances where just the parkour park is getting built. I do think Blake at PK Gen did some work where he's gotten parkour parks built on like school property. So that is another instance. But generally for cities, you're working on, again, you want to spend those years building that relationship enough to the point of where they can kind of spout what are the benefits of parkour. They're not saying like, the common objections, oh, this is dangerous, people are going to hurt themselves, whatnot. So that advocacy side, to give an example, so the Seattle park that's getting built, it's part of a larger project that is called the Garfield Superblock. There's a park in Seattle that in sort of central Seattle that was historically an underfunded, mostly BIPOC, low middle income neighborhood. And the city at one point had promised that they were going to renovate this. And then, as cities sometimes do when they don't pay attention to their marginalized communities, is they just go off and do other things. So there was this broken promise that the city had that the Garfield Superblock committee of volunteers, even before Parkour Visions got involved, they were already doing the advocacy, being like, hey, Seattle, you made this promise. They fortunately got a big boost during 2020, during BLM and during that movement, where Seattle recommitted to having that renovation happen. I say all that to say different cities care about different things, and knowing what your city's priorities are makes a huge difference, right? So like Seattle at that time really cared about working with, people of color. They cared about, fulfilling on that promise that they made. I've seen other cities, what they care about, like Colorado, for instance, at Cat Fountain, there was a period of time where that was maybe going to get demolished, and there was some work at the the Denver and the greater community there to try to like make sure it didn't get demolished. But if you remember that, they found out through conversations that Colorado, unsurprisingly, just really cares about like physical fitness for their community, and they wanted to see that there was proof that people would use that area, because what they were dealing with was that Cat Fountain was being underutilized. I believe it's still up and exists. I don't think it got taken down. There was some conversation a period of time of replacing it with a parkour park. I don't think any of that ended up happening, but that city is like, I want to see your numbers for how many people are actually going to do parkour here, right? And so being able to say, well, we have this gym community, we have these communities, and we have 200 some odd members, or we've taught this many people. That's a really important like metric to have, right? Idaho, that parkour park, it's under a bridge, this overpass, right, where they built both a skate park and a parkour park. Gorgeous locations, really cool mural behind the parkour park as well. Their city was pretty transparent that what they cared about was essentially, what's the word for it? Basically like trying to push out the homeless community there, being like, okay, we're going to activate the space, which sometimes can be code for sweeping the homeless people out. Of course, that didn't actually work. There are still homeless people that hang out at that parkour park and under that underpass. But some cities, that's what they genuinely care about, which is, I have my own political views about that, but it's important to know what does your city care about so that you can speak their language and talk to them about why parkour fulfills their goals, right? If they want to be, so I'm working with the city of Paris, PERRIS, out here in Southern California right now, and meeting with their city council. I kind of did my usual spiel talking about intergenerational play and safety, and here's what the flooring will look like and all the materials. The one that really got their interim mayor excited was just saying this would be Southern California's first ever parkour park. There's actually one parkour park that's in the middle of California, but to say this is Southern California's first ever parkour park, she was like, oh, interesting. So sometimes it's just straight up clout, right? That can be the thing that motivates them. So trying to kind of do some digging to figure out what do they care about. They also ask me questions, of course, like how many people are actually doing parkour, what's the benefit of this, right? Which I was able to say we have all these surrounding cities. Like Paris is basically in the middle of like 5 different parkour gyms in the area. So we're still having conversations there. But like that's going to take a little while. My next step here is to try to convince them to do something like a Leave No Trace Jam or some sort of way for them to see parkour physically, because most of these people were like, what is parkour? I've never heard of parkour before. Sounds cool. Thanks for the presentation. So now my next step is to maybe it's to do a jam and invite a bunch of the families out from these various gyms. Maybe it's to like do like a little spot mod or a festival event in their city. Their biggest concern was, okay, we got that the city has a bunch of surrounding cities with gyms, but what's actually in Paris and what's the number of students or people that do parkour in Paris itself? So that's sort of the next step, is to convince them that there are active people who will use this, right? So that's why the outreach and advocacy side of just getting involved can be a multi-year process. It can be events, it can be literally talking to the city council. At the end of the day, you do want to get in front of the city council with something, even if it's just to like whisper in their ear that a parkour park would be great. They might not have a space that they are renovating or a park that they're renovating. They may, it takes a period of time for them to acquire new land and then determine it's going to be a park, right? Or they like this existing park needs to be renovated. It's starting to fall apart. Maybe we want to change some of the priorities. With the Garfield Super Block up in Seattle, the tennis courts are being switched over to basketball courts because that's what the community is more likely to use, right? So trying to get in the know of when do your Parks and Recs committee meetings happen and what are their priorities, seeing if you can listen in, seeing if you can do a presentation. If you have other questions about that too, I'm always happy to share more specific resources about what I've included in the presentation and how I've like done some outreach to the city council to get that opportunity to speak. And that might take a while, like even talking to the Paris City Council, I initially booked them 1 month. It took them 3 months of pushing it back because their agendas were so busy. So it is like a very much on their time. And you just got to constantly be that like kind of fly on the wall, trying to like get your in and being like, hey, just checking in once a month. How's it going? Can I just making sure I'm available to present this next month, blah, blah, blah. So that's the outreach and advocacy side. Once they actually say, yes, we have interest in this, it's figuring out the funding for it. Now, if you're lucky, a city may already have funding. For context, a parkour park can cost anywhere from a really, really small one that's just scaffolding, could cost like 10K or something if it's just like a temporary, semi-permanent scaffolding kit that is being put up in the back of a school. But something like to the effect that is the more permanent ones that we're seeing around North America at this time, anywhere from 200,000 to $500,000 is probably the cost for that parkour park. And a lot of that goes into the safety flooring of it, whether you're pouring cement, are they wood structures? Are you using wood chips? Are you literally having to create that like kind of squishy safety flooring that you see in parks as well? So that's where a lot of the money goes. And where does that funding come from? If you're lucky, the city already has allocated funds. More commonly, it's going to be things like applying for grants. So with that stage, with Garfield Superblock, Park Revisions partnered with the Seattle Parks Foundation, which was another small nonprofit that works on park renovation, entirely separate to the Seattle Parks and Rec, which is like the city of Seattle. But that was a organization that they would do fiscal sponsorship for community projects that we're trying to advocate and would assist with grant writing, because you can find state, federal, private foundations to fund these kinds of projects for park renovations. They do exist. It's highly competitive, but that's, I think that the Garfield Superblock, big shout out to Garrett Moore as well, who was a part of Park Revisions, also a professional fundraiser historically, and is still on the committee with Garfield Superblock and was doing a lot of the grant writing. That while the parkour park, I think, ended up being $500,000, the actual park renovation was a $7 million project, and they had to do a lot of funding because they were doing like ADA accessibility and other projects across the park. And a thing that can happen is once you get funded, so it took them, I think, 3 years to get that funding because they're doing grant applications year after year after year. And there was a point when they went, oh my gosh, inflation is so high. Is there anywhere we could cut out of some projects out of the Garfield Superblock? And then they went and they looked at the Parkour Park. So after like multiple years of funding, they were like, maybe not. So I hopefully all this is not like super depressing sounding, but it is just, honestly, it's the reality of whenever you do see a parkour park, really do respect the work that has gone in to get that parkour park to exist, or any park in general, right? I mean, I think we really want to like respect our surroundings, leave no trace when we train, because it takes so much advocacy. I mean, the skateboarders did a lot of work for us, for building those relationships with parks so that we were able as parkour people to come in and say, it's similar in terms of safety to a skate park. It's not the same as a playground. Here's why. But yeah, so funding can take multiple years, and then there's still a chance that your tiny little parkour park compared to the rest of the thing, like you still have to do advocacy during that funding to say, this is why the parkour park itself is really, really important and valuable, and not like a bonus points add-on to a larger park renovation project, if that's what it is. Funding and design can happen at the same time as well. The design for the Garfield Superblock, for instance, that happened like pretty early on, and then the funding was still taking, years in advance, or multiple years to happen, right, and finalize. So obviously you need to have the design to say how much it costs. Depending on what the project is, you can be pretty collaborative, like Parkour Visions hosted a couple different info sessions with the designer Colin to get feedback on what the community, the parkour community wanted to see in the parkour park. And then we were able to like produce some images and saying, this is what it's going to look like, and build excitement out of that, right? And then from there, if you can jump through all of those hoops, really it's just construction. Construction is not going to be done by a parkour company. It's going to be done by a bidding process that the city does. So you need to make sure that it is understood enough that the design has been, the design has been looked through an architect firm and has been translated of, this is how we're pouring the cement, here's how these different holds are, right? Like all of that has a lot of like liability attached to it, which is why it's really important to be aware of, if you are interested in designing a parkour park, you actually need to limit the specificness of it so that if there ever was a major injury on that park, that any sort of liability would go to the landscape architects and or the city, not you. There's actually an amount of, if you design a parkour park too much in too much detail, it can leave you liable for if some sort of like specific corner breaks or something like that and it injures someone. So you can be a consultant, but there's a limitation to, are you actually an architect and have all the liability there. I think that's kind of my ramble at this point, just to kind of, again, those 4 stages are outreach and advocacy, funding, design, and construction. I personally think if you are an established gym, it's worth it to, like, you are the ones who have the most space and availability, like capacity to make it happen. Honestly, it's probably you're the one who can then, if you've been working with city council, maybe once a quarter, you go and visit with city council, and then you start doing an event once a quarter or something like that. Like, start slowly building that momentum year after year. You're the one who can say, we're holding this event, and here we have 100 people have shown up, and half of them are kids and half of them are adults, and being able to have the city council member show up and go, oh my gosh, this is awesome, and not at all what I thought. I was going to see people doing like really dangerous stunts, and there's like kids playing tag and like, adults learning how to be physically fit. That's amazing. You'll notice that my language is mostly about accessible parkour, right? Not the extreme sports side of parkour, because that's who mostly uses parkour parks, to be honest, right? Like, yes, advanced practitioners can and will use parkour parks, but oftentimes those are the people who are like, they are not utilizing a parkour park because they need access to parkour, right? The extreme sport side of parkour are more likely to find their own space, feel comfortable claiming not ownership, but agency in that space, right? The parkour park oftentimes serves people who would not otherwise feel safe training outside if there was not a dedicated space for them. And it can be a community hub for everyone. So keeping that in mind of realistically who does actually train at parkour parks, it's going to be a bunch of kids hanging out on stuff, right? It's going to be families. It's going to be teens. That's who it is. It's essentially like an outdoor gym, but free. All right, I'm going to pause there. I know I talked a lot. Thoughts, questions, haikus, or even just like a temperature check, maybe. I mean, is anyone like, oh my gosh, this was demotivating? Or was anyone the opposite where they were like, oh, I'm actually really motivated now. This, yeah, it's going to take a while, but it'll still draw some interest. Yeah, go for it, Quinn, and then Sam.
I think it helps give a lot of context to the process, which was really helpful. Like something that I didn't quite understand that you kind of shine some light on is like that you really have to get in touch with what your city is into. Like not every city council is going to be into the same thing. So while it's great to start like with like, trace jams and like everything, like you said, is super great. Like at the end of the day, you have to be able to like talk with these people and like figure out what actually motivates them to like get into something. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah,
Thanks
exactly.
for the info. And
Absolutely.
I found it motivating to answer your question.
Good. I'm glad. I will also add a little caveat. Thank you for the haikus. Another caveat is, yes, ideally you want to be partnering with them. I'll get to you, Sam, after this. Is you, to some degree, can strong arm cities a little bit. And what I mean by that is strategically utilizing newsletters or newspapers. An example of that being, so Seattle, since this is where most of my knowledge comes from, and every city is like really nuanced in what they love to do and don't love to do, and how like concerned their lawyers are about litigious issues and whatnot. So slacklining in Seattle for a period of time was illegal. And it was illegal because, slacklining started to get popular years and years ago. People started putting their slack lines up in parks, and then parks officials went, no, we can't, you can't do this. This is obstructing people's walkways and it's damaging the trees and all this stuff, right? Well, what the slacklining community did is they went ahead and, after unsuccessfully talking and getting any movement with the city council, literally having the cops called on them at one point for just putting up a slackline, right? They were able to, I don't know if it was a study or whatnot, but they were basically able to prove that slacklines don't damage trees, because the city of Seattle cares a lot about its greenery and the arbors and the trees and whatnot. So when they were able to work with the Seattle Times to write an article, it was from this perspective of this one slackliner who said, I have literally had the cops called on me for doing this very benign activity, which is just slacklining. Here's proof in the article that, like if you've ever done slacklining, there's like a little like kind of protective layer that you put on between the tree and the rope, right? Between the slackline and the tree. Prove that, look, this doesn't damage trees. It's something that people really enjoy. Like, why are you not encouraging that? They were essentially able to strong arm the city of Seattle to change their rules. And now slacklining is an allowed activity. So I would never say that is your first line of defense when trying to build motivation. But if you are dealing with issues like that, where it's like you've been trying for years, like it might be time to get the media involved, to be completely honest. Sam, go for it.
I just wanted to talk about, I thought that pretty much everything that you were talking about, I just found it really insightful to like the process. Kind of like I was saying earlier, I haven't really thought about any of this at all. So, and I guess also like, I guess like the part that was really interesting to me was the noting that like being the designer of a parkour park, like actually like under engineering it is like kind of important in a way. That's like really interesting. I like never would have thought of that. So
yeah, I think there's folks who are like, it's easy to fantasize about like training spaces, right? And being like, oh, what if I had this over here and this over here? And if you are privileged enough to be someone who's designed a gym, which sometimes like gyms were historically just like, let's throw some plywood together and that should be fine, right? I think we've been really lucky in that we've been able to DIY ourselves into building really good, stable structures. It's not the same in the world of parks, right? In the world of parks, like you need to have design insurance if you're to do a certain level of design beyond consulting. You need to potentially even have like an architect's license, which is really cool because there are people in the parkour community. There's Jade out in Chicago, Isabel Andrews as well out in the East Coast. Like these are people who, there's a couple of like students I've seen grow up in the parkour gym and then are now pursuing a degree in landscape architecture. Like that's the good stuff there. Actually, another way that you can still make an impact is it's very indirectly, but you could run themed summer camps. Parkour Visions used to do like a video and parkour summer camp where they do like stunts and stuff and felt and learned parkour through that. And then we would also do a couple of the themes like that. We did a park design summer camp as well. So it was like a little bit of how do you design a scaffolding kit together. You'd make a little model with like little like toothpicks essentially and marshmallows, and then you'd like learn how to put a scaffolding kit together, like a temporary pop-up kit. Like those are the kind of things that you can do to inspire the next generation, that this literally is a career path for them, that they could go to school for this if they wanted to. So it's good stuff. What else, y'all? I think that's basically all I've got on my end. So yeah, unless anybody else has questions, we can call it.
Corey, I'm sorry if I missed this. You dropped some fantastic information on this call, like stuff that I took a few notes on as well for like, I could do this. So, and we live together. So I really appreciate like you coming on here and sharing this. I don't know if you covered this, but I'm wondering, since we have people who are in a gym space on this call, did you talk about the difference that like parent involvement can make when interacting with the city? I think that's
great.
So important and critical, and a huge resource that gyms have access to kind of pull those levers, because cities listen to parents more than like anybody in my experience. But yeah, could you speak on that a little bit? I'm curious.
Absolutely, yeah, and thanks for bringing that up. As you can tell, I just have like this discombobulation of a bunch of information on this subject. So yeah, there's a lot of like little things for specific instances. But yes, parents are so motivating, like for cities to get things done, right? Parents can either be, I mean, we've all dealt with stubborn parents before, right? Parents get shit done and are the ones who are advocating the most for children, because literally they're children. With the city of Paris, at the presentation that I recently did for their Parks and Rec committee, I had the gyms actually reach out and say, hey, is anybody available, a parent ideally available to come out and present with me? And there was one parent who came with, and it was great because you have the perspective of someone like me who is an experienced parkour practitioner, can talk about sort of the like, what does the design aspect look like? What is a parkour? What's the benefits to the city? And then you get this testimonial from the parent who literally shared about how life-changing parkour has been for her kid, right? And how much she just would love so many kids to get access to parkour. Arguably, that's, while I'm sort of like the logistics person, I'm less of the inspiration person. It's really important to have that testimonial, right? Like there's almost nothing more motivating to a city than hearing voices from parents. Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Christopher. All right, anything else? Yeah, Mitchell, go for it.
A handful of questions and just comments just to give other people on the call. I tried to loosely look into a park, and for like a timeline, our city has like a 3 to 5 year pipeline for like submitting an application until it like gets looked at or possibly built at the soonest. Yeah. So the sooner you start that.
That's amazing that they have that transparent, by the way, because most cities don't. Just throw that out there. But yeah, that's great.
And if I recall correctly, I don't know if it's even just the application for the city to look at the parkour park application, or if it's just an application for funding through the park foundation. But it's just like saying get that in fast, along with everything else. And then on the topic of strong arming, we had a skate park that was going to be renovated and wrecked, but then I think like Tony Hawk like tweeted about it, and he's like, "That's dumb," and then they jumped on board, and I think it's still around as far as I can tell.
So skateboarding's been, just to jump in on that, skateboarding has been interesting because you've probably seen like DIY skate parks where they literally pour cement in a very arguably illegal way. But that is a way that skate parks have historically sometimes strong armed cities. They're like, well, it's already here, and what, you're going to actually take it down? And then they've been able to essentially build momentum from that. Yeah, sometimes by getting like a major name like Tony Hawk to be like, what? Your own city built, your own, neighbors built this? Clearly it's wanted. Why would you take it apart? There's a whole culture about like basically guerrilla style pouring cement in skate parks that I have not seen in parkour. I don't know genuinely if we should go that route, but I have seen, Daryl Stingley years and years ago, I think in the Bay Area, tried to make a DIY parkour park with plywood, just in an underpass, and it was taken down. Unfortunately, the city came by and said it's got to go. So there is some benefit to, it's a lot harder to just take down cement than it is some plywood. And I also actually want to briefly touch on space as well, and then I'll let you keep going, Mitchell, because I want to hear your other thoughts. Is early on, Parkour Visions tried very unsuccessfully to try to create momentum for a parkour park. This was like in the early days of Parkour Vision, so like over a decade ago at this point. But they were like, there's this really cool space that's under an underpass. We should be able to utilize it. What they later found out was that space was not owned by Parks and Rec. It was owned by the Department of Transportation. So basically the bus, like the people who handle the buses, right? Department of Transportation can own some very neglected land. Doesn't mean it's going to get transferred into the Parks and Rec department to be used to be created into an actual park. So that's another layer. So it could potentially, in theory, that'd be a whole other layer of advocacy, though, of just to be aware of some of those city dynamics. It has to actually be owned by the Parks and Rec department. All right, go for it, Mitchell.
Cool, thank you. The first question I had of 3 was, where do we start if you don't know what your city cares about?
I would look at what are the ways that you can get in front of them. Research who is on the city council. If you're lucky, if you can actually get an audience with them and have a meeting. For instance, the Parkour Park in Bellingham, Washington, north of Seattle, the guy who led the advocacy for that, he had it was like a friend of the family who sat on the city council. Paris, the big reason why I'm talking with specifically the city of Paris right now is because my boss's brother is on the city council. So it is a question of, is there anybody, maybe parents, in your existing community? I think we underutilize the parents in our community quite often. They can be volunteers, they can be advocates, right? But maybe there's just getting a feelers out and saying like, hey, does anybody know anyone? Because you might just, know someone through networking. Other than that, sort of working up the chain. That's why it is helpful to do those events, is sort of getting the person who's managing an event or a community center is not probably going to be the person who's in charge of, park renovations, but trying to work with them and asking questions of like, hey, this is something I'm also interested in. Who would you recommend I talk to? They might be able to give you an email of like their supervisor. You can chat with them, work up that chain of authority essentially with the city.
Okay, so that actually leads me into my next question. When reaching out, and really, it's all like particular, right? Depends on where you're at, but when trying to shoot for a parkour park, do you reach out to the city council first? Do you reach out to the Parks and Rec first? Because in our case, and the question is more generally asked, but in our case, Parks and Rec shut us down first. So then when we escalate to the next one up?
Yeah, you definitely can. Because the way that it works is the city council essentially is the boss of the Parks and Rec. So if you do get someone who's an advocate in city council, they can basically point and go do this project. We don't care if you don't like it, we're doing it now, right? So you can do that. The other thing to be aware of is what other neighboring cities are in your area, because like Seattle had like Bellevue and Redmond and like a bunch of different like neighboring cities around it. Same thing with SoCal out here in the Inland Empire that we're a part of. Paris may be a no-go, but maybe like literally a couple miles south is Menifee. Maybe they're really excited about Parkour Park. So like don't get stuck on the location, honestly. You want to kind of do as much outreach as you can. That's what I would say. But yeah, absolutely go above people's heads if you have the access to.
Okay. That's good enough. Last question is, how have you seen parkour parks influence and grow adult and teen communities?
Yeah, I love that question. So there's a great statistic, and this is something that I share with city councils as well when I'm presenting or just advocating for parkour in general. It's something like the average 16-year-old is as sedentary as the average 60-year-old. And that's pretty mind-blowing, right? There's also some other statistic on, I don't remember the exact number, but it's something like after a certain age, it might be like 25 or something, like you will never run again. People like literally just stop running after like their 20s or 30s or something to that effect. Don't quote me on that exact one, but those are things to be aware of as to like why parkour in a very, like, we have our own individual, like, yeah, it's super badass and it feels cool to do and like all that stuff. But like from a public health perspective, I think PK Silver has talked about how like parkour can teach seniors how to fall safely. Parkour can teach seniors how to like get up off the ground, right? Which is huge if anyone's aware of like what the number one or number two cause of death of seniors is, like falling and then breaking their hip, right? It's something big. So trying to create all this is trying to paint a picture of what would life be like if everyone had access to not only movement and fitness, but actually something that's motivating for movement and fitness, which is play. And parkour can be an adultified essentially version of play. So people who want to, not only are we trying to build this like healthy aging narrative, you can also talk about how so playgrounds themselves are designed for kids 12 and under. That's why anytime you go to a playground, you'll see literally like signs that say, if you're under 12, you can't play here. And sometimes it's like a young kid's playground. This is like for ages 3 to 6, right? In some cities, there are laws that if you are not an adult who is not accompanying a child, you are not allowed to be on that space. New York City is one of them, which is pretty messed up, honestly, if you think about it, right? It's, from what I understand, it was basically a law that was put in place to be like an anti-gang, anti-homeless. Don't love it, right? Don't love that we're literally limiting access to play spaces through age, right? So that's something I've talked about before and been like, okay, well, I'm an adult who wants to play and climb on things. Where do the teens go when they want to play on things? I mean, we're pretty aware that like skateboarding and rock climbing and things, like, these are all adjacent sports that benefit teens as well. So those are kind of the talking points that I try to work with when I'm working with that advocacy side about why parkour is beneficial to those populations. I'll also add, and then I'll let Brennan jump in, is it's talking with Colin McDonald again. He, started as a parkour park designer after starting as a coach at Parkour Visions and now works for an architect firm out in Colorado. He is discovering that there's some languaging that the parkour parks are starting to potentially get underneath the language of like adult playgrounds. And that has to do with the fact that the laws for playgrounds don't work well for what we want to do with parkour parks. So playgrounds, if you've ever seen a playground, there's very, very specific things about the placement of them. Like everything feels very connected, right? Where it's like, there's this element, it connects to this element, it goes to this staircase, which goes up to this platform, which goes to the slide. There's a lot of falling space around it. And there's a bunch of rails in very specific ways. Unlike our spaces, we want the most stuff in the area, right? Our goal is to jump from thing to thing or interact from one thing to one thing, versus in a playground, they don't want that. So legally, you can't call it what we're doing a playground. And that's why they're starting to get these like adult play spaces languaging that is starting to pop up as well. But currently, when I talk to parks, what I'm saying is this is more akin to a skate park, something that they're already aware of that has very similar like freedom when it comes to movement and build. I'm never calling it a playground. I'm always calling it a parkour park, similar to a skate park when it comes to safety. Because skate parks have one sign that is just up that says warning skate park. And that's what we see in parkour parks as well. Warning, play at your own risk. This is not a playground. Cool. Brennan and then Mitchell, if you have more stuff, I'm happy to hear it.
Yeah, you actually led into that partially at the end there. With Colin McDonald being on the meeting 1 week ago, 2 weeks ago for the national meeting, he mentioned that he's also finding a lot more success referring to these spaces or using the language of like a workout or an adult like a space for training instead of play space, and then kind of working backwards from there. I wanted to see if you had any interaction with that specific language as well when like pushing for these spaces.
Yeah, I've yet to see. I mean, definitely that's what I say, right? Like just word for word. I try to my best to compare it to something that they already know in existence, right? So most cities, if they have a skate park, if they're giving you concerns about safety and they have a skate park, like I'd be like, what is even happening right now?
Yeah.
So that's something to look into as well, and visit their existing skate parks and kind of think about what motivated them. I've even asked them that question too, of like, I've seen that you have 3 or 4 skate parks, what was the process like for getting them? Paris was funny. They actually told me that the skateboarders were really, really motivated and really, but sometimes a bit too pushy was essentially what they said. So it does show though that, being a bit loud and noisy does sometimes get your way when it comes to advocacy stuff. Okay, I think I'm going to, if anybody else has further questions, I'm happy to keep going, but I do want to offer a couple other resources. Brennan, you just reminded me. So last week, USPK, we just did our first online business conference. Colin McDonald did do a talk for that. We are going to be putting all of those talks up on YouTube in the next couple of weeks, so keep on the lookout for them. Jimmy from Motion Mentors did one as well too, so shout out to Motion Mentors. So that's something you could be looking for. There is also a design handbook, a parkour park design handbook that does exist on parkourvisions.org/design. That's something I have used as reference before when doing presentations. And then the last thing I will also share is if you do find yourself in a space where you are looking for funding and want to be applying for grants, something that a nonprofit, a 501c3 can do, something called fiscally sponsoring a project, which is basically umbrella-ing a project underneath its 501c3 like legal designation, which allows a lot of grants, especially the grants for parks and funding like that, are only accessible to nonprofits, right? So if that's something you're interested in, USPK does offer fiscal sponsorship as well. Right now we prioritize events, so like we will be fiscally sponsoring the women's gathering, Obsidian gathering, and we fiscally sponsored Art of Retreat last year as well. So that's something, so it can be for an event type project, but it also, we're hoping in the future to be able to fiscally sponsor park design and grant writing as well, similar to how I mentioned the Seattle Parks Foundation operated up in Seattle. So if that ever is something you're interested in, again, this is a long game, so it's not like, let me just think about it and we'll throw together fiscal sponsorship. It's like, we have a city that's interested and we don't have the funding. Let's figure out the funding. Feel free to talk to me, and happy to talk more about that through USPK. Cool. Brennan, go for it.
I think it's fair to say with any of that funding coming from USPK, the more that you guys can get underneath your belt, it sounds like the more conversation and the more things we can point to saying, yeah, we helped do this.
Yes,
we can just keep doing it more and more and more, right?
Exactly. I mean, that's a big reason why like Parkour Visions ended up just kind of falling into, honestly, park design.
Yeah.
It was in some ways kind of like, skill plus luck, right? Yeah, it's once you have that existing portfolio, it was actually easier to go back to the city of Seattle, even though Seattle has historically been very uninterested in the parkour park. But it was a lot easier to say, look, we've done these parks across the nation. They exist, right? It's not some like bunch of 20-something kids or whatever just trying to get a parkour park and they've had no experience working with architect firms, right? So yeah, working with an established community or an established designer goes a long way in convincing your city that you are legitimate in your goals.
Definitely want to follow up with you on some specific actions in the Cincinnati area. There's recently a park that burned down, and the skateboarding, everyone on the skateboarding side has a representative already that reached out to us and conversation of what that would look like to get a new park built.
That's
very
awesome.
long
Yeah.
process, nothing's set in stone, but I'd love to know like some of this, like reiterate, talk with you, make sure any of those first steps aren't being missed when we're
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to support you any way that we can. Also be friends with your skateboarders. Skateboarders have been doing this advocacy work for decades at this point, right? There was a community in Seattle again that was called Parents for Skate Parks, and they had like the number 4 and the letter 8 for skate. But you can look up their website and they have like 20 different projects, and 10 of them actually happened, because of all the advocacy work that they did to get like 10 or a dozen skate parks in Seattle. I've had meetings with them to be like, what was your process like? What were the areas that you felt Seattle gets hung up on, and how do we work with them or get past some of those blockers? So yes, create strong relationships with the skateboarding community as well, because you can partner. Great. Mitchell, go for it.
Quick question. Do you have any like recommendations for grant sites? Because I can never find a good one without.
Yeah, there's the one that I've seen the most is Instrumental. I think it's spelled kind of funky, like maybe there's like they've taken out the A or something at the end of it. But most grant sites, honestly, what I recommend is actually hiring someone who has experience in searching for grants and applying for grants. It's a very specialized skill, and usually, and I know of a a grant writer who does that kind of work for a couple thousand a month kind of thing. Like that's generally what you're looking for. Is an independent grant consultant is couple thousand a month, and they're going to apply for a set number of grants a month. And you can expect that a good grant writer probably is going to bring in like a fourth of the grants that they apply for. Like it's a very competitive process. So don't be surprised that your first period of time of applying for grants, it's like maybe you're going to get 1 out of 10 grants or something. And grant funders like to work with established communities, right? So like your first couple of grants might be like $2,000 or something like that, something that is good for like an individual on a scholarship level or something like that, or it could fund a class or an event, but it's not likely unless you have like an established track record getting like a $200,000 federal grant right off the bat. There are some government sites for grants. I can't remember what the URL is but it's something, if you probably just search like government grants, you probably will stumble upon that website. I think it's something like grants.gov. It might actually be something really benign like that. All right, cool. Well, thanks y'all. I really appreciate the time and the listening, and I hope this was valuable. And yeah, if you have anything else, if you ever have any questions or know anybody else who's trying to get this stuff figured out, always happy to jump on a call, support any way I can. Love this work, deeply passionate about it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Corey.
Thank you,
Awesome,
Corey.
everyone. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Corey, so much. Thanks for being here, everybody. Really appreciate it. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day and week. Bye.